What can we learn from the last 2 years living in a global pandemic? Michael Lewis is a best-selling author of The Fifth Risk, The Big Short and Moneyball. His latest book, The Premonition, looks at the official response to the COVID outbreak by the US administration. I spoke to him earlier. Michael, thanks so much for coming on the show. I've read lots of your books and it's really, really great to meet you.
Total pleasure.
So thanks for coming on. And I want to start with The Fifth Risk, which as a political journalist, I have to say I found absolutely fascinating. It's this story of the transition from Obama to Trump and basically what a mess it was. Trump resistant to even having a transition team, hundreds of posts left empty. But before we get into the book and what it's about, and also it being making into a TV series, can you explain to the viewers what does the fifth risk actually mean?
Well, the title comes from a conversation I had with someone who was managing existential risks in part of the US government. And I was just asking him, like, what are the top 5 risks that you worry about in your little department, the Department of Energy? So I'm worried about nuclear weapons going off when they shouldn't go off. And we spend a lot of time thinking about that. Or not going off if we need them to go off. I'm worried about the Iran nuclear deal because we're in the middle of that. So he's listing them, and he gets to 5. Yeah. And when he gets to the 5th one, it's such a boring sounding one, but it ended up being right at the center of the story I was telling it. And he says the 5th risk, I'm going to call it program management. And with it, what I mean by that is there are these risks that the United States government are managing that they go through for generations. They're long-term risks. And that if we take our eye off the ball, catastrophic things can happen, and there are these things throughout the federal government. So when I called the 5th risk, I was thinking, like, these are the risks you as a citizen are oblivious to. You're just taking it for granted that your government is handling it in some way more or less competently. At the same time, you yourself probably think very little of your government because you're an American, and Americans have been trained to hate their government. What happens if this goes wrong? So the book, that was kind of a starting point for them.
There is the 5th risk. There are all these risks within government, and then President Trump is elected.
And it tells you a lot about the state of our society, right? So by law, the outgoing administration, in that case the Obama administration, is required to prepare briefings for the incoming administration because our government, unlike yours, is managed by presidential appointees, not career civil servants. So 4,000 plus people are going to roll in with the new president and are going to have to be appointed by him and confirmed by the Senate to run all these different agencies.
OK, let me ask you another question, because viewers here might think, in the UK, might think Trump's, it's done, it's over, there's a Biden, it's a new era. But how worried are you about Trump coming back and becoming the president again in 2024?
I wouldn't like it.
Are you worried about it? Do you think it's a possibility?
Of course it's a possibility. And of course it's unpredictable. If you ask me to put odds on it, I'd say 5 to 1 against. I don't think it's the likely outcome.
Why? Because you think the Republicans will alight on a different candidate?
Yes, I do. And I think he's not good at being president. I mean, he didn't. If he had run a half-decent pandemic response, he'd still be president. That his incompetence ends up being a big issue. And
we're going to come on to the pandemic, but before I do, just quickly, because the thing also about the 5th risk, I mean, everyone should read it. I actually listened to it on a pod. I listened to the audio book. But also it's been made into a Netflix drama, right?
Just came out, yeah.
By the Obama production company.
Yes.
So how did that come about? Had they got? Why did the Obamas want to televise a book about that's so critical of Trump? Is there an agenda there?
I tell you what's funny about it. You would think the way you just put that, Obama saw an anti-Trump thing and thought, oh, we'll put that on television.
That is what I thought.
It's the opposite. That they've been bending over backwards, the Obamas, to avoid engaging in any kind of overt political kind of messaging activity. What attracted Obama, so it counted against the book that it had this kind of anti-Trump undertone. What appealed to him about it was the first attempt to really describe what the hell the government did. You know, like these management of existential risks that nobody knew about. He really liked the idea of basically delivering an entertaining civics lesson.
I thought maybe part of the Obama's motivation for televising this was to actually kind of send a warning to America as they saw it of don't make the same mistake twice, guys, if this man runs in 2024. But that wasn't...
It was a different warning. It was to deliver. It was, okay. And the warning was, you neglect this government that you have at your peril.
What's he like? What's it like doing a project with him?
Well, I met him because I wrote about him. I wrote a big piece for Vanity Fair years ago, and I kind of moved into his life in the White House when he was president and got to know him a bit then. In some ways, a very unlikely politician, in that you don't feel like you're with a politician. You feel like, you know what he's got the temperament, the personality of a writer. Fun to be with. I was very fond of him. I mean, interesting guy. I think I told him once, it may have offended him, that if he was not black, I don't think he'd have been president, because the fact that he was black disguised just how unpolitical he was, unlike a politician he was, that how peculiar he was. And the truth is that this man would never have been a politician if he'd had a successful literary career. He started out wanting to write short stories, and they didn't get accepted. And I think he's like a writer who stumbled into politics and found a calling. But you do mistake him if you think like the reason he grabbed my book was it was a way to needle Donald Trump. It was the opposite. He told the producers that leave Trump to one side. This isn't about Trump. They didn't listen to him completely.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
but how could you?
One thing that really astonished me in the book is the moment where you say Trump finds out he's won, Pennsylvania's called, and then Karen Pence goes to hug Mike Pence, the vice president. Or, sorry, Mike goes to hug Karen. Yeah. And sort of for a congratulatory hug, and she kind of pushes him away and says something like, "You got you got what you want."
She was offended by him. I mean,
offended by who? Mike Pence or Donald Trump, or both of them?
Donald Trump and Mike Pence's allegiance to him at that moment. You got what you wanted, Mike. Leave me alone. I mean, you got to remember, this is she's a good Christian lady from Middle America, and Donald Trump is violating everything she believes in left and right. And I think she was offended by him. I've never heard her say that, but that was, I interviewed people who watched that encounter. And so who knows exactly what was going on in her head. Let's
go on to about the pandemic, the pandemic book, The Premonition. You talk about that, about what happened in the US. It was a UK, for us, it was a traumatic experience too. 180,000 deaths here. In the US, with a much bigger population, of course, 1 million deaths. In your book, you say America or the West developed the tools to defeat a pandemic, but America didn't implement those tools. What do you mean by that? Was that a Trump problem or a US government problem?
It's the most remarkable story. We both share, and we kind of both share this story. There was a study in 2019 done at great expense, millions of dollars, hundreds of experts, to determine, this is before the pandemic, which countries on the planet were best equipped to deal with a pandemic. Like who had the resources, who was going to respond best. The United States came out #1 and the UK came out #2. So we, in theory, are best prepared for this. In practice, our death rates were off the charts. I mean, we're kind of like, I don't know where the US is now, but we were 120th, somewhere down there. You know, Yemen outperforms this kind of thing. And so that was the beginning, what interested me, is like, what happened?
Have you come up with the conclusion that we would be better or worse equipped to cope with another pandemic as the result of the COVID experience?
We as a world, or we as the United States?
Well, let's do both.
So we as the United States are clearly worse off.
Why?
Because there's not only no agreement on what we did right and what we did wrong, there's active disagreement. And 40% of the country won't get vaccinated. 40% of the country thinks that the social interventions were pointless.
But sorry,
so it'd be harder to lead the country.
But Michael, is that not just partly also not about the sort of, about the who was in power? I mean, you know, some of the disinformation. I remember watching that press conference agog, as Donald Trump said, you know, what we could do, I remember it, you know, we could inject disinfectant as a coronavirus. Do you remember it? I remember it. I was watching it. And then Dr. Birx is sort of standing, the camera pans to the to the health official, and she's just staring. I mean,
no, I know.
But the point being that there's a serious. I mean, the thing was ludicrous, but there was a very serious point in that, which is if a leader shares disinformation, then the anti-vaxxers and people stop believing in the process. I mean, presumably under a different leadership, it might be better for the US if there was a pandemic.
That would be true, would have been true, had there been different leadership the first time we went through this, and people could have been led. And so instead of 40% of the population revolting against the right thing to do, would have been 20%. But now they've revolted and dug in their heels. They'll be much harder to persuade. I mean, there will be if there were, right now, if a more lethal pathogen swept across the United States, there would be an instinctive and well-organized resistance to doing anything to defend ourselves.
Michael, just before we end, I hope you don't mind me asking you about this. As you were writing the book on COVID and what was going on, your own family experienced an unbearable tragedy, and your daughter, I hope you don't mind me asking you about her. Your daughter, Dixie, died in a car crash.
Right as the book was coming out. And it's been the hardest year of my life. She was 19. She was with her boyfriend, Ross, who was a year older, Ross Schultz, and they drove in broad daylight head-on into a truck. And it makes one aware of a few things very quickly. One, how precious life is, and two, how it can change in a heartbeat. And three, the amazing thing to me right away was I've never had this kind of grief. I've never experienced this kind of loss. My parents are still alive and flourishing. And instantly, I was admitted as a kind of citizen to the kingdom of grief and made aware of how much of this there was around me to which I had been oblivious. Close friends. And especially now, how much loss people have endured in the past couple of years. And there's a psychology to loss. But it's an inarticulate psychology. People behave differently when they've experienced the loss, and it expresses itself in strange ways. I'm just trying, personally, to navigate it in my own way so I minimize the damage it causes. I loved her so much. I was so proud to be her dad. She was just the best human being, and she was going to change the world. I can't do anything about the fact she's gone. All I can do is make sure that what happens next isn't worse or bad. I can just try to respond in positive ways to it. I think that I cannot speak for other people in their grief, but in my case, the experience of loss is a loss of love. And leaning into love in various ways in response to her death has been enormously healing. Leaning into other people's need for love. So it's the tempting mistake that I think we've been avoiding is denial. Just
on the writing, you've written about finance, you've written about policy, you've written about so many things. Do you think now you might write about grief, that might help other people grieving?
Yes. I'm not quite sure what form the writing is going to take. I know it won't take the form of a how-to, because I think it's so peculiar. The experience of grief is sui generis. That, grief is grief, but it's not. Each person's grief is different. It depends on the nature of the loss, the nature of the relationship you had with the person who's lost, who you are, how your chemicals work. So I'd be very wary about telling people how to go through this experience, except to say, however you're going through it is fine. Walk in and embrace what's peculiar about your own response, because there's some truth in that. Now, how I write about it, I've got some ideas about how I might write about it, but I'm not going to ever be in a position of preaching to people or how they should experience their own loss. That wouldn't be my style.
Well, thank you for talking to me about it, because I'm sure that many people watching it find it very comforting, because I don't think any of us talk about grief
We don't do loss
enough.
well.
We don't do loss well, and And a lot of people live through it and find it hard.
Yep.
So thank you. And
Sure.
I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.